Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, particularly since our offices at the Bulletin are in the Harris School. So I am now part of the larger University of Chicago community, and was one of the key reasons that I was really excited to join you today in this new capacity. Just to share with you before we jump in, the Doomsday Clock, which has been around since 1947 and actually garners enormous conversation and is a product we're really proud of because it really focuses for a moment the world's attention on the threat of nuclear weapons and the threats to mankind, like climate change. As I was taking this job, and one of the responsibilities is to manage the process of setting the time. We had just moved it from 5 minutes to 3 minutes to midnight to kind of point out how worrisome the situation actually is in this new nuclear age, as dubbed by The Economist. So it moved just from 5 to 3, and I don't think it's because I was taking over the Bulletin, but the timing was a little inauspicious. But at that time, looking at it, my husband said, "Do you think maybe you want to introduce daylight savings time or something?" And I said, that is not going to be my first initiative at the Doomsday Clock. But we will talk about nuclear and nuclear energy in a little bit as part of my talk, because one of the reasons I was so interested, there were so many reasons I was interested in this position, but one of them is this fascinating conversation, very controversial conversation that's taking place across the globe, to less extent here in the US, but across the globe, on the future of energy and the role for nuclear, and the developing economies moving so hard and fast, and particularly in the parts of the world that we're interested in here on nuclear energy. So I'll offer a couple ideas at the end, and happy to have any conversation that you want about that. The topic of, the title of my presentation, The Changing Middle East Landscape Today, is constructed as such because I think that there's 4 global realities that are shaping the Middle East, but that they have in common with the rest of the world. And so I'll put them out there as kind of global trends, but then connect them to the US. So in some ways, I think this is really the frame to what my colleagues have just been talking about, and in some ways they pulled it all together, but in some ways sets it up, and could have probably gone first on that if we had thought more about it, or I had thought more about it. But the first emerging global reality, which we are well into and are really one of the key actors here in the United States, is a fundamental transformation in who's producing energy and who's consuming energy. And we in the United States, obviously with our shale revolution and our decreasing dependence in some ways on or our increasing efficiencies, are really part of this. We had been this importer, significant importer of international energy, oil and gas in particular, and suddenly we're moving towards a position where we're going to be the producers of that. We will eventually be exporting considerable amounts of gas, I would wager a very good bet on. But it's not just the United States that is kind of moving from this position of being a producer to a consumer. China very much is moving from being we're moving from consumer to producer, and they're moving from producer to consumer. So they have now moved to a position of being a net importer of oil. And we know that so much of the spike in prices in the mid-2000s had everything to do with a massive onslaught of Chinese demand, of needing these energy resources. And that in some part, and we'll talk about this later, a part of the collapse in prices with the sudden recognition that even though China would keep demanding energy, it was not going to be nearly at the levels that they had been. And in fact, China slowed up a little bit faster than we anticipated, and that was in part that was a contributor to this collapse in prices. So producers are becoming consumers, consumers are becoming producers. We see this with India coming on as well. They were never real producers, but they're going to become really important consumers into the future and shape global energy markets. The second major trend that we see that's quite important to what's going on across the energy landscape is increasing populations and a desire for a speedy development and a demand for the kind of amenities of a comfortable middle-class living that we in the industrialized world have had for a period of time, emerging economies demanding that very quickly as their populations grow rapidly. So this is the story of the developing world, and we know we're going to be talking in the next panel on youth in the Middle East. This is a big issue in the Middle East and many emerging economies of these really young populations. Well, those really young populations, whether they're in Africa or Asia or the Middle East, their demands require energy. And so that sudden spike in need that's contributing to this kind of shift from producer to consumer and consumer to producer. The third trend that will frame kind of the energy markets and has real relevance to the Middle East, which we'll get to, is that governments are finding it harder and harder to buy stability. When populations were smaller and when it wasn't so apparent from 24-hour news about what was going on in the rest of the world, it was easier for governments to be able to provide goods to their population and say, you know, you're doing okay. And for populations to say that's really enough. That's not really working anymore. That kind of, there's an essence where it works, but the recognition that maybe there's something more out there and the relationship between the population and the governments is changing, and that those kinds of subsidies to keep the stability aren't really working will factor into kind of how we understand the energy landscape, and I'll turn to that momentarily as well. And then the fourth, and this is playing itself out across the globe, is the recognition of climate change and the harm that carbon does to our environment, and that kind of pervasive knowledge that as countries think about their energy mix, that there's a pollutant that goes on that's going to eventually have significant, and already is having significant consequences for the globe. Harder to talk about in the United States, easier to talk about elsewhere, but this dawning reality, I put that as fourth. Very, very intentionally, not because it's not important, but that reality hasn't driven the kind of policy changes that a lot of the advocates had hoped for. But what it has, and these other things are going to, the high price of oil was driving a search for renewables, the smog, so to some extent the environment in China is driving it. But why it's so important is because this is where nuclear is going to come important in the nuclear discussion. There's increasing public support for energy decisions that have a positive climate change consequence. And that will, as we turn to the Middle East, explain actually high support for nuclear power. So we talked about, so going back to the first one, the consumer-producer flip. So I talked about the US, I talked about China, I talked a little bit about India. What do we mean by that in the Middle East? Where are some examples that we can turn to see this flip? And not related to the GCC directly, but it wouldn't make sense in the regional context not to talk about it, is the kind of Israel-Egypt flip on gas, which Egypt had been a major exporter of gas to Israel and beyond, and to Jordan. With what's happened in the last couple of years and sabotage to its gas pipeline and the recognition that they had these growing populations that had needs and was very clearly, not being satisfied by the protests in Cairo, you have Egypt moving from a producer and exporter to a consumer. It is now in negotiations with others, the Israelis in particular, about how they can import gas. The Israelis, who were very clearly an energy poor state, have suddenly found massive gas plays in the Eastern Med. That's going to fundamentally change their position in the region and beyond once they work through a lot of the domestic issues about taxation and that they're grappling with. And it changes the possibilities, quite frankly, of Israel's role in the region and its negotiations with some of its partners. The US government is very, very interested in this and what possibilities that might open up for Israel. What was very interesting, I was just in the region a couple of weeks ago, and I was with a group of students actually. We were in the UAE, Jordan, and Israel. And it was very interesting to kind of talk with Israelis as they were kind of thinking about these monopoly issues that they were struggling with and taxation, because they've never had to think about kind of energy policy before. They don't have any energy experts. They have a lot of technical, but the legal structures and all that is just absolutely absent right now for obvious reasons. But here, like the rest of the world, is kind of the situation where a major consumer is suddenly in its position, as we and others are, about being a producer. So you have that shift, and then you had Jordan, who had long is always a consumer, but had long depended on gas from Egypt, suddenly realizing that they didn't have gas anymore from Egypt. They didn't have any subsidies on oil as they had back in the day from Saudi Arabia, and they were in a real energy crunch. So both countries, Egypt and Jordan, as well as Palestinian Authority, right now at this moment, just having signed long-term gas deals that has the potential to shift the politics as we know it, but we'll all be watching that carefully and see whether that happens. So we have a case of that flip in the Middle East, but moving to the Gulf, which is the topic of our conversation today, the UAE, which we always think is a massive exporter of energy, is an important importer of gas. So they have a long-term deal with the Qataris and others. And so even in the area, even in the countries that we know the best and say, well, they're still producing, you don't have that flip, there is a reminder that the mix in the region has changed and different relationships are evolving, in part because of this need for energy. So that's the first one, the producer-consumer flip. What about increased populations? I don't have to tell this crowd about growing population in the region, but we have this case in Saudi Arabia, as Jean-Francois Sesnick pointed out, spending billions of dollars to create its energy base, major producers in chemicals. If you look to Turkey, again, not our focus, but shaping the region as we know it, in 2013, Turkey's budget from energy imports was 20%. So 20% of all of its imports were devoted to energy, and Turkey isn't unique in that. You can look across emerging economies. But this is whether Turkey becomes, what the Anatolia tiger that people had hoped for or not, largely depends on them getting their energy right, and whether they can keep this deal with their population about what an emerging economy owes to their citizens. They've got to get their energy right, and they import almost 100% of its oil, almost 100% of their gas, and 1/3 of its coal. So a massively dependent energy state. And where do they get most of this from? Russia and Iran. So if you're sitting in Turkey, you're trying to figure out how you get yourself out of this conundrum, but you're also trying to figure out what do you have to do to change the environment where you can depend on Russia and Turkey for the future of your energy needs, because you're going to need it. And even if Turkey employed all of its renewable assets, and it has some, but all of its solar, all of its wind, all of its hydro, all of its geothermal, employed all of it and somehow had the grid to move it around, they'd only be at meet half the energy needs of their projected growth. So a real challenge as their populations increase. The UAE, another country that I was just in, so its experience is more immediate to me, expected to double its energy consumption between 2008 and 2020. Those are huge numbers. It's not a big population, nonetheless expected to double. And so if they need to provide for their populations, they're going to have to figure out their energy situation. And they don't want to consume all of their oil. And that's what's driving a lot of their change. They don't, right now they're using oil for electricity, which is so inefficient. They don't want to use it in that capacity. That's why they're importing from Qatar. They want to figure out some sort of alternative so that they can sell one of their most valuable assets, their oil. They don't want to keep it at home. They want to find other things. That's why they're investing in solar, and that's why soon we'll talk about they're investing in nuclear. So what did I mean about governments finding it harder to ensure stability? Here I really do think about Saudi Arabia, but in Bahrain is a great example of the need to begin to diversify the economy, exactly as our keynote after lunch spoke about, which is Bahrain can't afford the subsidies that go into providing these goods to their population. They've got to think about how their economy diversifies, but of course it's very, very politically challenging to reduce subsidies, not in Bahrain or Saudi Arabia, everywhere. The populations get used to that, and oil had been cheap, and so this was an easy way. And how can you be living in the Gulf countries and have to pay higher price for energy? It doesn't make any sense, even if, as we heard earlier, the country's running out of it. So right now, in yesterday's paper, the reports of Bahrain really beginning to think about how do they begin by reducing subsidies on industrial consumption. And if they can do that, maybe that's easier. They can begin to move to reducing subsidies in the civilian sector, but it's very, very difficult. But can they afford to do this? So when the Arab Spring broke out, all front page newspapers was this, we watch government after government after government fall or struggle. The Saudis, right like that, were able to put $120 billion of cash and subsidies into the market to try to keep their population with them. When you hear the numbers that Jean-Francois was talking about those drops, those numbers, which once seemed somewhat manageable, given that oil was at $100, $110 a barrel, no longer seem so manageable. So how do you begin to transition away from that situation? Something that many of the countries that we're looking at are now struggling with and thinking about in this kind of fast-moving tectonic shift, a fast-moving tectonic shift. That's not a good analogy. So someone can come over with a fast-moving race car shift. I don't know. But it's very interesting. Energy markets don't move that fast, and suddenly they're moving with lightning speed. And the Middle East is a real kind of center for it's a laboratory in many ways for what's going on. And then the climate change aspect of it, and this is what I begin to find so interesting, is that climate change was something that was being talked about in the Gulf well before it was really kind of taken seriously here in the States, because they saw the degradation of an energy economy. And I remember going over in the 90s, and with the military coming in and out, it just felt like all of the emissions and everything, the Gulf felt more polluted, and there was a sense that you could taste it sometimes in the air. Nothing like China, but that change of moving to an industrial, to a modern economy, brought with it pollution that was felt very much day-to-day lives in the 1990s. And so as climate change became a global topic of conversation, it was very easily absorbed in the region, those conversations. And you see, it's kind of shocking if you're not thinking about the context. You see these efforts towards renewables, across the region, and you saw them in poorer states, and you saw them in richer states. You saw them in richer states like the UAE, because they didn't want to consume their best product. They wanted to sell it. But what struck me was in Turkey and Jordan and Morocco, you saw this real push to renewables. And again, why is because they couldn't afford to import energy oil when it was $110. It's a little easier when it's 40 or 50, but still, that's a lot of money that's just leaving the country when there's very little money to give. And what's interesting about that is sometimes when we talk about climate change, we think about it as kind of a rich country's luxury to talk about. Right, which is, it's a wealthy economy, so you have the luxury of thinking about climate change. We just have to get to that level of development, and then we'll. That's how it has been framed. But when you go into these countries, you see, no, not so much. In fact, they're leading in their efforts to bring solar to Jordan and solar for sure to Morocco, because they can't afford the import bills. So it's thinking about these issues as economic issues as well as a global need, and that brings the population along into an easier conversation if the leaders choose to have that conversation. So how is the region moving forward? We talked a little bit about the gas deals between Jordan, Israel, and Egypt. We talked a little bit about renewables in Morocco, UAE, Jordan. They're really moving forward very strongly in very important and interesting ways in nuclear. And here, if there is any area that I say you should all study, because I'm going to do it, so I need some help in people doing it, is to focus on the evolution of nuclear energy in the Middle East more broadly, and the GCC in particular. The Iran deal has kind of put this front and center into conversation of, can you have a civilian program that's divorced from a military one? And that's the kind of crucial challenge that the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, hasn't really been able to figure out how to ensure that with evolution, the evolution of technologies, and the negotiators are at the table trying to figure out whether or not there are safeguards that we can put into place that the United States can feel comfortable and their allies in terms of this kind of program. But the Iran deal in some ways is shedding light on this issue, but it's also taking up all the attention, which is there's a very, very interesting example in the United Arab Emirates, a country that is going to have 4 nuclear reactors that go operational starting in 2017. 2017 is the first one, and then almost every year after that, the next 3 come online. And the UAE has become the gold standard for how can you create a nuclear program that has the blessings of the international community. And they've done it in very close consultation with the IAEA. They've done it in very close consultation with the US. They've brought in the South Koreans to create their program. They've got 15,000 people working as we speak on that first reactor, and they're just going to move them right down there. They've got all the money in the world to put against it, which they're putting against it, and they're on time, which is unheard of, right? And Jean-Francois and I were talking, the French are never on time, we're never on time, they're on time. So they got South Koreans, project abilities and UAE money. It's like a match made in heaven, right? So they're building forward on this in a way that's really quite fascinating. And I'll share with you something actually, and I put it out there as a hypothesis that this story is right. It makes a ton of sense to me, but I haven't researched it. But I was talking to someone who would know, works very closely with defense contractors in the UAE and American. And he said, and I find this fascinating, one of the reasons that the US actually got on board with the Emiratis was because the Emiratis that had been arguing their energy needs and this and that, and it's interesting enough, and we weren't taking it that seriously because they have so much oil, but all of a sudden they started switching their argument, and their argument was, if we can create a gold standard in terms of not enriching, getting rid of our waste, dealing with it in a responsible way, then the Iranians cannot say, no country would ever take the terms that you are putting out. Because you can point to a state right on its border that's actually pursuing this in an extraordinary manner. And so there may be a security story to me that makes a lot of sense. He would know, but I'm just passing that along as a story because some great graduate student's going to write the paper on that, and it'll be truly fascinating. So the UAE has this example, and so they're in partnership with the South Koreans. So Turkey and Jordan. Turkey has had a long-standing nuclear program. It's been trying to have nuclear energy since the 1970s. We've been working with them on that. But it's really in the last 10 years or so, because of all the factors that we were talking about, that they have moved very hard and fast on nuclear. They had their own economic problems that slowed it down. But they too are advancing slightly slower than the Emiratis, but kind of right alongside or slightly behind them. Now, what's so interesting about the Turkish program is the Russians are building it. And here you have a NATO ally with the Russians building their nuclear program. And the terms of it are extremely interesting. It's called buy, own, and operate. And what that means is the Russians have said, we will front all the money for this thing. We will build it for you. We will bring in the enriched uranium. You can run it, and then we will pull it out so you don't have to deal with storage, and we'll deal with it. So it's a Russian operation. And over time, as it starts kicking off a profit, you guys can begin to buy back this reactor to the point of 49%. So we'll still own 51%, but you'll have 49%. So what the Turks are doing, in many ways, is renting the energy, right? They're working with the Russians to rent the energy. Now, I'd submit if the Turks, and I say this with, if you look at where the pipelines are, as I said, most of the Turkish oil is coming from Russia and Iran, so they're highly dependent on the Russians. So this doesn't get them away from their dependence on Russia, it just diversifies. However, if in this moment, Turkey just came out and said, with everything else going on, you know what, we're going to sign a big old gas deal with the Russians, and we're going to, import even more energy, like, for instance, the Chinese and the Russians did. The US and its allies, I would submit, would probably go bananas. Like, are you kidding me? Already we have all these problems, and now you're going to increase your energy dependence. But because it's a nuclear plant that's not physically connected, and because we think the Russians are actually responsible in dealing with the waste and the enrichment, which is fascinating to me, we kind of just let that go. So there's an interesting relationship developing that I think bears attention. And Jordan's deal is somewhat, and we still have to watch it, looks like it will be very similar to that Turkish deal. So when I was in Jordan 2 weeks ago, you may have seen in the paper that the day we left, again, I don't think it was because we were there, but the day we left, Jordan signed a $10 billion deal with the Russians to begin to move to the next stage of nuclear cooperation. So watch this space about how the Russians are kind of building their relationships and leverages around energy, and actually nuclear energy, in the Middle East. So what does this all mean for Saudi Arabia and the Iran deal? I have a yellow card, so you're going to have to figure it out on yourself. We can talk about it in Q&A. Very short, what's my conclusion to all this? The energy landscape is shifting, and it's literally shifting under everybody's feet, and we are not paying attention to it because it's not the Arab Spring, because it's not the Arab Winter, because it's not the Iran framework negotiation, but these trends will shift political relationships slowly, but assuredly, in ways that it would make a whole lot of sense to be paying attention now and think through whether they're good for the United States and whether they're good for the region. And I'd submit to you that I think it's a big question mark. So with that, I'll leave it back to you.